After gluing the two halves together of the plane, I had to flatten the bed where the iron will rest, and also the front here. I used my homemade plane float, and I don't know if you can see it there, but it's got basically saw teeth like a rip saw. This one's 1 inch wide. It gives me a little bit of surface to work, and it leaves a pretty smooth surface. And it took a little bit of work. I used an existing blade and would set it in place, and I could check for any wobble, and I just kept working that float until it was perfectly flat and that blade bedded nicely. Okay, what I've done here is I've made a couple of small temporary wedges for each side to go with an existing blade that I have for my other plane, which will be about the same as the new blade for this one. And that lets me get the exact angle and a perfect fit between the blade and the abutment, and then I can use this as a template when I start to work on the actual stock that's going to be the real wedge. And actually, with this in here, I was able to go ahead and use the plane and make sure that it didn't chatter and everything fit nicely, and test it out ahead of time. So with that done, I'm going to pull this wedge out of here and use it to mark my new wedge. I've taken a really sharp pencil and marked a line along the wedge, and I'll extend that line down to the corner here and just stand this on edge and cut away the waste on the bandsaw. In fact, I'll mark the waste side so I keep my blade in the right location when I cut. And there we have it. Okay, here's our wedge rough cut, and it's pretty flat and straight right up until it gets to this edge here where the bandsaw blade kicked out, and it's got a bump there. So I'm going to have to knock that off there to start with. On this oak, it works pretty well to plane across the grain to get less tear out. It doesn't seem to matter which direction I go along the grain, it wants to tear out at least a little bit. So I'm going to start with a block plane and just kind of knock that corner off there. And then start working along the grain to make sure this is flat. It's not too bad. And then I'll just keep fitting it into the plane body and check it. Okay, plane that and sand it a little bit, and I've got a real close, there's a little bit of play, but it's a real close fit on the width. You don't want much slop in there, because when you cut out the center here, and you just got a little bit on each side down by the tip of the blade, you want it to fit close on the side so that chips can't get between the abutment and the wedge. The other thing I need to check as I continue working on this is that the taper on the wedge is the same as the taper on the abutment. So right now it's pretty tight down at the bottom, but I've got a little bit of slop at the top of it. So I need to take more off the tip and then work that taper out flat. And one more thing I need to look for is that both sides tighten up at the same time. I don't have one that's tight and one that's got a gap. There can't be any play in this at all. It's got to be dead on. And this side's a little bit loose, so I'll take a little more off of this side with my hand plane. I mentioned my sandpaper earlier. This is a self-adhesive 4-inch wide, or 5-inch wide, 4.5-inch wide, 100 grit stearate sandpaper, and I'll just do some final cleanup. This is on top of my table saw, so I've got a good flat surface to reference off of. Okay, I've put the blade in and I've set my wedge gently. And what I want to do now is look up inside the mouth of the plane, if I can get it on camera here. And I can see that the wedge is still a little too thick. It doesn't come down close to the opening on the mouth. It's still back up in there 3/16 or so. So I need to thin this down a little bit more to get it to come more forward so I can have nice horns on it. Okay, I'm still working on the wedge thickness. It's a little too thick yet, but I'm checking it each time I taper, or each time I take more material off of it to make sure it still fits good. And also when I set it, you can't see the blade is behind here, but I can't move that blade. If I can move the blade, I may have one side a little thinner than the other. It's not fitting quite as good. So I just want to be sure that that blade stays good and tight as I continue to take material off of here. Okay, I flattened the blade. It was a little bit crooked, or excuse me, the wedge. It wasn't quite the same thickness all the way across and wasn't fitting perfect, so I took a little more off one side and flattened it again. And now it's actually protruding through the mouth opening, so we're plenty good for marking this to cut. So I went ahead and put the blade in, set the wedge, and I'm going to go ahead and mark it along the abutment with a sharp pencil, and then go ahead and mark it down as far as I can into the mouth opening. And I'll go ahead and kind of mark out where I want the top of the taper to be. Somewhere in here probably. And we'll take it out and start working on it. Okay, I've darkened in my lines. I've got what I call the horns marked out, where the start of the taper will be and where the end of the taper will be. So this part here will be all cut out. From here to here, it'll taper from a sharp, almost a knife edge, up to the full thickness at this point. Alright, there's our first step. I've bandsawed away the waste material here. This shape will fit with the taper on our abutment. These two sides here will stay full wedge thickness along the edges, and that'll sit with the abutment, and then this will get a taper. Alright, so now I'm just going to take a fine blade saw and lay it up along here and go ahead and make the cut for my taper so I can kind of have a guideline on the edges, and then I'll chisel that out. Alright, I'll stop sawing there. I'm a little short of the full depth, but I'm going to go ahead and take a chisel and start kind of cleaning out some of that waste. I can always saw a little deeper as I go. Okay, I've kind of whittled that down a little bit with my chisel. I'm going to take my float and kind of flatten it out and work on it a little bit more and refine it. Alright, on these tips, I want to pare these down to the pencil lines with a chisel. Just kind of sneak up on it. Down to a sharp point at the tip, and I'll just work them close, and then I'll fit them into the plane and see how they look. Okay, after some final cleanup and sanding and cut it off to length, put some chamfers on the top, it's pretty much ready to go. Okay, I've got the wedge all cleaned up and ready to go. Went ahead and set it in the plane, and I've got a little piece strip of pine here just to test it on. And there you have it. It's working just fine. Need to trim off the ends and put chamfers on the corners and a little detail, and of course fit the tote on the back, and then a little oil finish and some wax, and she'll be finished.